What was she like to work with?
Oh, you know, when we first met, before we did the pilot, I said, she was 12 years younger than I, and I said, Carl, she's awfully young. And she had this kind of mid-Atlantic accent, like a Katharine Hepburn. She had never done comedy.
He's one of the most beloved faces in television history. Charming, funny, and full of joy. But after nearly a century of life in the spotlight, Dick Van Dyke is finally ready to talk about the moments that weren't so cheerful. From backstage tensions to emotional betrayals, the names on his list may surprise you. There are 6. Some were legends, some were close. One nearly wrecked a classic. And one, he never even forgave himself. What happened behind those smiling scenes? Who dimmed his shine? And why did he let it happen for so long? The truth isn't pretty, but it's unforgettable. Mary Tyler Moore. On screen, Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore were the perfect couple. Their timing was flawless, their chemistry electric, and audiences believed every laugh and every loving glance. But off-screen, things weren't quite as charming. Behind the scenes of The Dick Van Dyke Show, emotions were more tangled than the scripts. Dick later admitted what fans always suspected. He had a real crush on Mary. It was something he kept buried, never acted on, but it added a subtle tension to every scene they filmed together. When the show started in 1961, Mary was just 25 years old, 11 years younger than Dick. He'd initially questioned whether she was right for the role, even telling creator Carl Reiner she seemed too young to play his wife. But Reiner insisted, saying audiences wouldn't notice. And he was right. Once the cameras rolled, Mary became Laura Petrie, and the age gap melted away. Still, that uncertainty never quite left Dick's mind, and as their working relationship grew closer, so did his personal feelings. The set itself was tight-knit and high pressure. Everyone knew each other's moods, habits, and even secrets. While Dick and Mary kept things professional, he later revealed that the unspoken feelings between them created an undercurrent that was hard to ignore. They spent long hours filming, rehearsing, and promoting the show together. The bond deepened, and though they never crossed the line, the emotional tension lingered. It wasn't just acting, it felt personal. Mary later joked in an interview, "The amazing thing is, we never had an affair. I always thought it was a terrible waste." That quote, meant to be lighthearted, actually said a lot. Both of them knew something real could have happened. But with Dick married at the time, and Mary involved in her own relationships, it became a delicate dance of restraint. The restraint made the performances stronger, but behind the scenes, it made every shared moment a little more complicated. Growing into successful development, then, the show began to take off, and along with it, an intense focus was shown ever more brightly on Mary. She became an overnight sensation. Fans and producers adored her charisma, style, and comic timing. Dick was watching her change from co-star to the star of the show, and while he never displayed envy, it was a change that no one could miss. All were talking about Mary. The press wanted her. Audiences loved her. And then the producers started writing more and more to emphasize her abilities. This happened not to all people. Rosemary, who played Sally Rogers, thought she would play the Julie Adams role alongside her. But then, with Mary putting on more and more popularity, that little name started to feel cramped. And then, the tension began to be palpable on the set. Dick was caught between maintaining the show's face, which had his name in the title, but somehow seemed to be being pulled in different directions. Suddenly, he was torn between a castmate feeling underappreciated and a co-star he, frankly, admired a little too much. But Dick never said anything bad about Mary, neither harsh nor critical. He appreciated her gifts and her professionalism, as well as her instincts. But, according to him, working with Mary was emotionally exhausting. Not because she was difficult, but because he had to monitor emotions that he could let no one know about. It was not even a co-worker crush, but a quiet kind of hungering away at you day after day. He stored it for years without ever letting it go. Looking back, he called it a terrible waste, similar to Mary's words. It is one of those rare stories in Hollywood where the heart is not broken through betrayal or drama. Rather, it is through self-respect from two people having bright feelings, but not damaging something which is already magic. Yet, he lingered with that silence in love, which returned, shaping his memories from the show and labeling Mary Tyler Moore as a co-star he wouldn't forget, but never quite forgive himself for loving. The tension between them wasn't just scripted. Trust us, the next reveal hits even harder. Rosemary. In the early days of the Dick Van Dyke Show, Rosemary thought she knew exactly where she stood. She was a seasoned comedy veteran, a vaudeville legend, and one of the few women in Hollywood who could go joke for joke with any man in the room. When she signed on to play Sally Rogers, she believed she'd be the show's female lead. At the time, Mary Tyler Moore was just 25, relatively unknown, and cast in what was initially seen as a supporting role. But the balance of power shifted quickly, and Rosemary never forgot it. As the show gained momentum, Mary Tyler Moore became the breakout star. Her character, Laura Petrie, wasn't just the doting housewife. She was funny, charming, and effortlessly stole scenes. Audiences loved her, producers noticed, and suddenly, the show that was supposed to spotlight Rob's work life began focusing more and more on his home life. That shift meant fewer punchlines for Rosemary's Sally Rogers and fewer pages in the script. It wasn't long before Rosemary started voicing her frustration. She went directly to the show's creator, Carl Reiner, and made it clear she felt sidelined. She'd built a career on her voice and wit, and now she was being quietly pushed into the background. She believed that her talents were being overlooked, and she blamed the show's sudden fixation on Mary. The tension wasn't subtle. Cast and crew could feel it in every rehearsal, every read-through. Reiner tried to keep things from boiling over, but in true Hollywood fashion, his attempt at smoothing things out only made it worse. He reportedly told Rosemary and Mary, "You both have great legs. They just prefer to look at hers." What was meant as a joke came across as dismissive, and Rosemary took it personally. She wasn't competing for attention based on looks. She wanted recognition for her talent, her timing, her comedy chops. Being reduced to a comment about legs cut deep. Dick Van Dyke was caught in the middle. He had huge respect for Rosemary. He knew her comedy instincts to be wise. But he also knew what was happening with Mary. Her character connected with audiences in a way that even the network hadn't counted on. To Dick, the set was almost like a silent battleground. The laughter you heard in the show? Many times, that laughter was exactly the kind to drown frustrations and bruised egos just off-screen. With all that being said, Rosemary never allowed any of it to touch her work. She would come, hit her marks, and deliver every punchline as any good pro would. But the years have since gone by, and that resentment has not left her. In later interviews, she reasonably brought attention to the imbalance time and time again. She felt she was promised one thing and was given another, and while she did not fault Mary herself, the pain of being overshadowed by someone younger and newer never really went away. To Dick, it was tough watching Rosemary become increasingly distant. He and Rose started the show as great friends. As the spotlight moved off her, however, so did their cute camaraderie. The joy of ensemble comedy was exchanged for a rather subtle competition. Even at the high watermark of the show, when the ratings soared, there was always this feeling that something wasn't quite right in that other world. The Dick Van Dyke Show became a classic, and Mary Tyler Moore then ascended to the television stage in superstardom. For Rosemary, however, it was the bittersweet experience that came with professional pride and personal disappointment. He remained a great admirer of her gift, but their relationship was no longer as simple or cordial as it once had been. Often, the worst chasms are not blown apart by arguments or scandals. They are created simply by a quiet replacement. Phil Erikson. Before he was a TV icon, Dick Van Dyke was half of a two-man comedy act trying to make people laugh without saying a word. The duo, Erik and Van, the Merry Mutes, was something no one had ever seen before. They didn't speak. They didn't sing. They lip-synced old records and pantomimed stories so perfectly that audiences couldn't stop watching. It was silly, clever, and completely original. But what made it magic was the chemistry between Dick and Phil Erikson, the man who believed in Dick before anyone else did. They met in 1947 when Van Dyke was just 22 and hosting a local morning radio show. Erikson, already an experienced mime, saw something in the young DJ's timing and physical comedy. He made a simple suggestion: "Let's team up." That offer changed Dick's life. They hit the club circuit hard, performing 5 shows a night, sometimes 7 nights a week. In 1950, they set a record with 35 shows in 1 week. To Van Dyke, it felt like they were on the brink of something huge. Then came the break they'd been waiting for, their own TV show in 1951, The Merry Mutes Show on WSB-TV in Atlanta. Their act exploded. They were invited on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1952, the biggest stage on television at the time. One routine, a slow-motion football sketch, became a nationwide sensation. For the first time, Dick felt like he was truly part of show business. But just as fast as it all came together, it all fell apart. In 1953, Phil Erikson walked away. No fight, no scandal, no betrayal. Just gone. He decided to quit show business entirely, leaving Dick stunned and directionless. "We were just getting started," Dick later said. He never fully understood the decision. There was no long goodbye, no talk of burnout or second thoughts. One moment, they were rehearsing. Next, Dick was on his own. In showbiz, partners drift. But this felt like abandonment. Van Dyke never really appeared to be one for bashing Phil in public. He wasn't that kind of man. But the pain was evident when he had to talk about that chapter. He found someone with whom he shared a rhythm, energy, and creativity. And just as they were beginning to build something together, it was lost. And this has nothing to do with the famous feuds of Hollywood or creative quarrels, for this was not one. This was just quiet, terribly quiet. And this silence created a different impression. The next couple of years found Dick grating along. He had TV hosting stints, attempted and failed at leading a game show, and took minor sitcom roles. None of these truly seemed to offer the kind of security and creative fulfillment Erikson had. He essentially had work to rebuild, emotionally as well as professionally. This is a downward spiral that takes a long time to recover from, for it involves having one's first creative soulmate walk out on you without warning. Trust is hard to rebuild after that. Years later, Van Dyke would refer to the breakup of the Merry Mutes as one of the turning points of his career. It taught him about resilience and made him more guarded. It was not just the end of an act, It was the end of an era when everything could have gone one way, but didn't. It hardened him, made him push harder, work longer, proving to himself and the industry that he could make it big without a partner. In the end, Erikson faded into obscurity while Van Dyke became a living legend. Still, the phantom of that early partnership stalked him. Sometimes the hardest breakups are those outside of romance, more so in Dick's case, where the man who kick-started his career also taught him his first real-life lesson about heartbreak. In many ways, the exit of Phil was to determine every partnership that Dick would ever form after that. He learned very early that chemistry was not something that could be auditioned for. Either it sparked, or it did not. The abrupt loss of that spark made him weary of ever relying on anyone again. As his career blossomed, Dick became the solo resilience master, able to carry a show, support a scene partner, or charm a live audience all by himself. Deep down under that independence lay a quiet pain. The knowledge that once upon a time, he had been paired with someone who made the work feel so easy. If losing a partner felt like abandonment, imagine what it's like when the man who made you walks away. Carl Reiner. Carl Reiner didn't just create the Dick Van Dyke Show, he shaped Dick Van Dyke's career. The show was based on Reiner's own life, and he originally planned to star in it himself. But when CBS executives hesitated, it was Reiner who made the call to hand the role to Dick. It was a last-minute gamble, just 18 days before filming started. But it changed television history. Van Dyke was thrown into the spotlight, and for the first time, he had the chance to lead a show. But even from day one, the power dynamic was clear. This was Carl's show, and Dick was working inside someone else's vision. At first, the relationship worked. Carl wrote, directed, and steered the tone of the show with precision. And Dick, still building his reputation, was grateful for the guidance. But as the show found its rhythm and soared in the ratings, Van Dyke started wanting more input. He was the face of the series, America's favorite husband, and yet he often felt like a guest in someone else's creative house. When decisions were made, they weren't his. When tension rose between cast members, like the feud between Rosemary and Mary Tyler Moore, Carl ran interference, not Dick. Reiner was brilliant, but he was also unbending. Dick once admitted that even small suggestions on set had to go through Carl first. Scripts, casting, tone, it was all tightly controlled. The show's huge success, ironically, gave Dick less room to move. He respected Carl deeply, but resented that he couldn't shape the thing he was helping to make iconic. While the world saw a perfect sitcom, Dick was quietly struggling with creative frustration behind the scenes. After the original show ended, their paths diverged. But in 1971, Van Dyke launched the new Dick Van Dyke Show, and this time, Carl came back as a writer and advisor. The setup was different. Dick played a talk show host in Arizona, and the series was pitched as more modern, even edgy. It tackled subjects like interracial relationships and child-free marriages. Dick was excited to do something fresh, something that reflected the changing culture of the 70s. But CBS wasn't ready. They cut out an episode entitled Lieutenant Preston of the 4th Cavalry, which dealt with a controversial subject. Van Dyke was very proud of the episode. Carl Reiner wrote it, but CBS canceled it without warning. That was a slap in the face for both of them. And that was the final straw for Reiner. He left the show on the spot, just walked out. No long fight, no public fallout, just gone. For Dick, that moment was a disaster. Reiner had been his mentor, creative partner and friend. And then, just like that, he was gone. Without Carl's writing, the show felt lost. The ratings were already in a downward spiral, but now the heart was no longer there. Dick later said it felt like all the wind beneath that show had been shot down. What began as an opportunity to be very bold and personal ended up being a failure in slow motion. 3 seasons were all the second show had in 1974. The project hadn't gone down in flames the way others do in Hollywood, but the damage remained. Van Dyke always walked a fragile line with Reiner, grateful student, yet frustrated performer. Their partnership created wonderful collaboration, but damned Dick with the price of working in someone else's shadow. Dick learned that if you are never allowed any say in the decision-making, even success becomes a prison. Through the years following that, Van Dyke and Reiner remained friendly. Sometimes they'd get an occasional dinner together, but the initial dynamic, where one man created the world and the other merely lived in it, would never entirely vanish. Dick would give credit to Carl for the start of his career, but he held a grudge for the constricted space for growth he had been given in it. Sometimes, the hardest breakups don't come with shouting. They come with silence, with someone walking off the set and never coming back. That creative tension remained with Dick long after they ended shooting. Whenever he received a new offer, he would weigh not only the pay, but also how much freedom he would get to exercise. The Reiner years imparted a costly lesson. Being the principal star did not necessarily mean having a say. Admiring Carl's genius left Dick wary, a bit bitter. Years later, Dick would laud their friendship, but one could sense a hesitance when it came to creative freedom. He had vowed never to be placed in such a powerless situation anyway, not even within a genius's grasp. It wasn't exactly a feud. It was more like a creative partnership that gave and then took away. Walt Disney. Walt Disney gave Dick Van Dyke the role that turned him into a global star. In Mary Poppins, Dick played Bert, the happy-go-lucky chimney sweep who danced across rooftops and into movie history. But behind the scenes of the magical film was a story far less whimsical. Because while Walt opened the door for Van Dyke, he also let him walk into a storm without protection. And for Dick, that left a scar deeper than any critic's review. From the start, Van Dyke had to fight for his place in the film. Disney didn't want him to play the second role, Mr. Dawes Sr., the elderly bank director. Dick wanted the part badly enough that he paid for his own screen test and even removed his false teeth to look older. To most actors, this would have been beneath them. But for Van Dyke, it wasn't about ego. It was about proving he could do more than sing and smile. Walt eventually agreed, but the way it was handled made it clear. Dick had to earn every inch of space in the Disney world. Then came the accent, the infamous, often ridiculed Cockney accent that followed Van Dyke for decades. It became a punchline in pop culture. But what most people don't know is that Van Dyke wasn't given proper coaching. His dialect coach was Irish, and, by his own admission, not any better at it than he was. Van Dyke didn't know it was that bad until audiences reacted. The worst part? No one on set ever pulled him aside. Not Disney, not the director, not a single producer. They let him walk into cinematic history with an accent that would haunt him for life. Decades later, Van Dyke still joked about it, calling it the worst Cockney accent in movie history. But the laughter masked a real bitterness. He'd worked himself to the bone, literally, completing the grueling step-in-time dance scene over 23 takes at age 41, and poured everything into that performance. He sang, danced, acted, and even took on a second role. But instead of being praised for his versatility, he was mocked. And Walt Disney? He never stepped up to defend him. Van Dyke was not merely a hired actor. He was someone who remained loyal to the project in a way people rarely are. Van Dyke never accepted any payment for playing Bert. The fact is, he worked for free on one of the most iconic parts in cinema because he believed so heavily in the movie. And when the backlash arose, Disney left him to take all the punches. No one protected the man Walt had put forward for the job. In Hollywood, this kind of silence carries a strong weight. Years later, Van Dyke would always praise Walt Disney, saying, "He believed in me," intermixed with, "He was a genius." But there had always been a quiver of hesitation in that voice, gratefulness layered with the quietest sort of regret. Because Dick knew deep inside that belief had its limitations. The moment public protection came, Disney let the narrative shift, and Van Dyke became the punchline to the very same career-defining moment. What's even weirder, thanks to the accent and backstage neglect, Mary Poppins became a roaring success with domestic earnings surpassing $100 million, which made Van Dyke an overnight sensation. But with that success, there always came the shadows. Every time somebody tried mimicking his accent or ridiculing his performance, he was reminded of how he came into it, not being guided, but being thrown into it. And Walt let him sink or swim. Good old Walt. In the end, Van Dyke never quite received the credit he deserved for Mary Poppins. He gave it his all, his voice, his body, his pride. And while Bert was loved all over the world, Dick couldn't forget how exposed he had been on that stage. For all the magic that the House of Mouse promised, he had learned a bitter truth. Sometimes, the man who opens the door is the same one who leaves you standing out in the rain. On the contrary, what really hurt was the change in Dick's faith regarding trust in Hollywood, which such an experience brought about. He came in with the conviction that loyalty, passion, and talent would suffice, that if you gave your heart to a studio, they would back you. What he learned instead was that even the great Walt Disney could be forgotten when the criticisms began to fly. From that event onwards, Dick grew more guarded with his collaborators. He brought the joy of being to his work, but after that event, no longer assumed anybody in Hollywood would support him. That loss of faith did not make him grow bitter. It made him grow wise. But it also left a quiet scar that walked with him on every film and during each interview that followed. Keep your expectations steady, because this top story strips the magic right off the screen. Himself, haunted by fame and regret. Dick Van Dyke made millions laugh, but for decades, he couldn't even look in the mirror. While audiences saw the charming song and dance man on screen, behind the scenes was someone he barely recognized, a man slipping deeper into addiction, infidelity, and shame. Fame didn't just change his life, it split it in two. There was the version the world loved, and the version he kept hidden from everyone, including himself. It started in his 30s, right around the time The Dick Van Dyke Show made him a household name. He was surrounded by parties, success, and pressure to be on all the time. So he started drinking. Just a little at first, something to loosen up at social events. But it crept in fast. Before he knew it, it wasn't just a bad habit, it was a full-blown dependency. He said it himself. He was shocked at how quickly the alcohol took over. By the 1970s, the man who once lit up television screens was drowning behind closed doors. He'd become angry, withdrawn, and moody. Words that didn't even seem to belong to the Dick Van Dyke people thought they knew. He checked himself into a hospital in 1972, trying to get clean. It was a brave move, but it wasn't the end of the story. Recovery is rarely a straight line, and for Dick, the emotional damage went deeper than the drinking. His marriage to Margie Willett had already been strained by fame, distance, and conflicting lifestyles. She hated Hollywood. He couldn't leave it. And then, while still legally married, Dick began an affair with Michelle Triola. At first, it was innocent. Phone calls, lunches, but it quickly spiraled into a full relationship. He tried to juggle both lives, husband and father by day, secret partner by night. It tore him apart. Their marriage crumbled. After 36 years together, they divorced in 1984. For a man adored for portraying the all-American father, this was a horrendous time. He recounted later that the guilt of those years nearly smothered him. While the public saw someone quite wholesome, he felt inwardly like a phony. Even his long-standing love of the next 30 years with Michelle was a lie that he never quite forgave himself for. The hardest part? Knowing it never needed to be. Dick said fame affected him. However, not in an ostentatiously flaunting Machiavellian power sort of way. It was a slow erosion of his very sense of self that numbed his soul. He became someone who hurt other people, someone he used to judge. And that was the unsettling part that haunted him long after the applause had faded. During his later years, Dick spoke with brutal honesty during interviews. He talked about the terror he felt about what he saw within himself during the darkest days. He said he was not the person his admirers believed him to be, but he did not shy away from it. He owned it. He wrote a very honest memoir. He spoke at recovery events. He turned that very same platform that almost tempted him into self-destruction, into a begging post to pull people from the edge. Dick Van Dyke is 99 years old today and still dances, still smiles. But his wars were not fought on a stage. They were fought in the silence of his own guilt, regret, and redemption. Greatest enemies were not co-stars or studio executives. They were the shades of selfhood that fame almost created. And the miracle is not even that he survived it. The miracle is that he came back and is now stronger. Dick Van Dyke found himself alone many times during the quiet moments in between laughter and the spotlight. Not in a physical sense, for they were always fans and co-workers and handlers surrounding him, but in an emotional sense, the more people adored him, the more he disconnected from that image. The hardest part, he once said, wasn't drinking or even the shame. It was waking up every morning to put on the show, the entertainer, the optimist, the effortless-looking everything. But behind the walls, it weighs heavily. He wasn't just running from his blunders, he was mourning the identity that he used to be, long before all of this fame rewrote the storyline of his life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the untold stories behind Dick Van Dyke's legendary career, don't forget to like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes drama and Hollywood history. And don't go anywhere. Click the video on your screen to watch the next story we know you'll love.